I'm Cynthia James, and this network is about changing lives one woman at a time. Hello and welcome to Women Awakening. I'm your host, Cynthia James, and I'm excited that every week I get to come to you and bring you a powerful woman, an extraordinary woman, a woman who has found her niche in this world and is here to make a difference. That's exciting to me because I think it's the time for women emerging. I really believe that the frequency on the planet could use more of our nurturing, caring, kind self. And so I believe that if we can bring that energy up, you know, we will bring more kindness and compassion and empathy to the planet. So we do these every week. We're on all the platforms, Spotify, iTunes, iHeart, Spreaker, Amazon. We're on video, YouTube. You can also go to cynthiajames.net. That's my website. You can join my private community, and there's gifts and all kinds of things, and there's a lot going on in my life, and I'd love to share it with you. Today, I have a guest that I actually met a few months ago in an interview. And it was just so easy to have a big conversation because she's very good at what she does. Her name is Molly Worthen. She is an associate professor of history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. She's also a freelance journalist. She received her PhD from Yale University. And her research focuses on North American religious and intellectual history. She has a new book. It's called Spellbound: How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Trump. It comes out next spring, and it's already available for pre-order on Amazon. She's created audio and video courses for the great courses on the history of charisma and the history global Christianity since Reformation. And both of these are available on audio. I just think it's so cool that she's doing things that we can all access. Worthen writes regularly about religion, about politics, higher education for the New York Times, and has also written for the New Yorker, Slate, The Atlantic, and other publications. Molly, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm very excited to have this conversation because I loved talking with you for the other article. But first of all, I want to start with, how did you grow up? You probably didn't drop on the planet saying that I'm going to be a professor and I'm going to have religious studies as my focus. How were you brought up?
I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago, a town about 20 miles west of Chicago called Glen Ellen. I, gosh, I grew up reading Greek mythology and history with my dad, especially. And I remember really loving history in high school. I had a passion for theater and forensics, debate, speaking to big audiences. And so I guess in that is a kind of glimmer of my future career as a professor. It was really when I got to college and I was taking all kinds of humanities classes, history, philosophy, literature, and I began to see that for 99% of human beings, religion is an incredibly important part of it is often the frame through which they understand the world. And I had not grown up in any religion, just kind of cultural observance of Christmas and Easter, but really not a religious household. But I became really fascinated by both the role of faith communities in history, but also I was meeting a more diverse range of people in college for the first time. I was meeting, really observant Jews and Orthodox Christians and, people from all kinds of backgrounds. And I found myself kind of envious of the sense of community and connection and the answers to the big questions about the universe that they had. But I wasn't, I think I was kind of uncomfortable just sort of approaching religion, doing the things that people who grew up in those communities do. I didn't really understand the idea of worship or what it would mean to try to have like a relationship with the divine. That didn't compute. But what I did know was how to study, how to read a lot of books. And I also became increasingly interested in journalism. wrote for my college newspaper, had a few summer internships at city metro papers, loved having an excuse to just interview interesting people. I mean, as you said, this is how we met. I interviewed you for an article about a spiritual community you know well. And so that became another way of just kind of learning about humans. So religion has become kind of my focus, but I'm really interested in the role that ideas play in people's lives and where they turn to for guidance about their big decisions. And so I've ended up with this sort of hybrid career where I'm based in a university. I do as much freelance journalism as I can because I love interviewing people.
Yeah, and you're very good at it. Well, I want you for the audience to tell us what is charisma, and from your point of view, how has it shaped the history?
Oh boy. Well,
I know it's a big topic. I
yeah, of
know.
course. And I've spent the last few years working on this. I've got this book coming out in May, but you'll have to bear with me because this will be one of my first conversations about it. I don't have my pat answers down. I mean, I became fascinated by charisma because it is one of these terms that I think we punt to when we are witnessing a phenomenon. We're watching a relationship between a leader and followers that we cannot make sense of by appealing to straightforward material motivations. Something weird is going on, and so we say it's charisma. But what is that, right? I mean, I think it is uh, this allure that gives a leader the power to move a crowd. And I think the heart of it, and this surprised me in my research. I think I went into my research on charisma confusing it with charm, confusing
Mhm.
it with celebrity. And I found myself writing about figures who often were not particularly charming interpersonally. Often they weren't good looking. They weren't necessarily great orators. They weren't spellbinding speakers. What they all had in common is the ability to tell a compelling story, to tell a story that invites potential followers into a role, into a new understanding of themselves and their personal plot line. I think humans are narrative creatures. We
Yes.
understand the world in terms of stories. We're constantly looking to make sense of our suffering and our chaos in some way, right? Like it has to all have a point. It has to be going somewhere. And I think charismatic leaders are those who sense that the existing stories out there are not satisfying some important subset of people. There's a hunger for a new account, and a need to be invited into a new narrative. And so that is really the heart of charisma.
Well, you know what I love about what you just said is what you just said is what makes an incredibly successful speaker is
Interesting.
that they can really tap into a narrative of what that audience needs and deliver it in a way that motivates people to change or shift or grow. So I love what you just said because we've watched it historically, right? I mean, we've watched it in politics and religion. We've watched it historically, but does the charisma circumvent rational thinking?
Oh, this is a great question. And I don't want it to become, I'm glad you asked this because I don't want it to become a diagnosis of a situation that then gives you, the observer, an excuse to not take people's arguments seriously. And I think this is can be a real hazard in our current political environment when whatever side you're on, the temptation is to view the other side as just crazy, just not even worth reasoning with. And so I think that just because we think in terms of stories, it doesn't mean that those stories aren't rooted in a reasonable assessment of our situation. I think the key thing we have to remember when talking about what it means to be a rational thinker is that any system of reasoning depends on certain presuppositions. And if you dig down into the foundations of any person's worldview, you will eventually reach a set of bedrock presuppositions that cannot necessarily be proven. They can't be empirically demonstrated. They have to be assumed. And so humans with different presuppositions may both validly apply the process of reasoning, but reach very different conclusions because maybe their assumptions about what constitutes a flourishing human life are different. Maybe their assumptions about whether there's a God or not differ, right? And so these have real implications. But just because someone's presuppositions are different from yours, it doesn't mean you can dismiss them as irrational.
Right. I love that you said that. Well, and I want to talk about the intersection of charismatic leaders, politics, and religion, because it seems to have all around the world, it seems to have kind of intersected in interesting ways that impact the the whole.
Part of what I found myself trying to do in this book was find some way of understanding what has happened to the human religious impulse as Western society has become more secular. So,
Mm.
as every year the pollsters tell us fewer people are going to houses of worship on the weekend. Fewer people say that they believe in God, right? I mean, there's a sort of this. It's not a cataclysmic decline, but it's a slow decline.
Mhm.
Institutions in general have less authority over our lives than they did a generation or two ago. But I firmly believe that humans are religious creatures, and I think you can make that argument about what humans are like, regardless of whether you yourself, as a scholar, are totally a materialist who doesn't think there's any supernatural element, or if you're religious, because of course evolutionary psychologists who are themselves atheists often have an account of why humans have evolved to
Mhm.
create ideas of the divine and religious practices, right? So, putting aside that question, I think the way humans behave in the world, they're religious. They seek connection with something transcendent, some source of greater meaning outside themselves. They seek objects of worship and a community to do that worshiping in. And we're at a point, those of us who make our career studying religion, where the traditional ways of measuring that aspect of human life don't work so well anymore because fewer people show up to church on Sundays. So the
Mhm.
question is, where is that impulse going? And I think one place we can look for it is in the relationship that people develop with charismatic leaders. And so much of my book is, I mean, it's about kind of the intertwining of what Americans look for in a leader, and leaders who arise kind of outside of the ordinary structures and institutions with this charismatic storytelling ability, and how that is actually intertwined with the history of charisma in the sense that that word is used in the New Testament. So, in the sense of God's gifts of grace, speaking in tongues, prophecy, healing, this tradition of connecting with the supernatural and believing you can be filled with the Holy Spirit, with God's charisma, that is so potent in American history. And I think that really, although sometimes they can seem like wildly different phenomena, a political rally, for John F. Kennedy or Adlai Stevenson, on the one hand, as compared to Pentecostal revival, under a tent, right? On the other, they seem like very different things. I think there's less daylight between them than maybe first apparent, and that they speak to related impulses. They speak to a universal desire for connection with a transcendent story. And part of our task as observers of American culture in our current moment is to just get a little more creative about how we study and keep track of that, the way humans answer those big questions. What's the transcendent frame of meaning in my life? What are my objects of worship?
Yeah, well, and I love that you're talking about this, and I love what you're saying because I feel like if I stand back, I think people at the core want the same things. They want to be loved. They want to be safe. They want to be feel like they're important. They want to feel like they can take care of their families. I mean, I think there are some basic needs, things, like, in the hierarchy of needs. But but I think that when you talk about a charismatic leader, if some of those things aren't happening and the charismatic leader is talking about those things, then I drift over because I think maybe this person has a message or an answer for me to get there. So my question is though, is like, because we've watched communities, families split apart because one person's over here or the people are over here. Is there a bridge to help us come back to, for lack of a better word, loving one another?
Hmm, man. I mean, I guess if I had the straightforward answer to that question, I would be able to solve a lot of our problems. I, I think that in so many ways, human nature hasn't changed that much, and we are tribal creatures who have this abiding instinct, and you can see it as the fruit of evolution. You could see it as original sin, right? Like, no matter what your metaphysics, we have this instinct to draw boundaries between ourselves and the other. And I think we're constantly, we like to think about modern society as a story of progress, and we are getting so much better at coexistence in a flourishing way with kind of broadening range of people. One of my colleagues talks about the widening circle of we, right? Like who
Mm,
counts as we? Certainly for most humans, like that, the answer to that question has gotten bigger over the centuries. But I often think that tribal instinct to project evil and problems on outside of myself and onto the other, it's like just there under the surface. And it doesn't take a lot to kind of release it. I mean, I guess so that's like a 30,000 foot reflection. I think on a practical level, the thing I do whenever I'm interacting with someone with whom I know I have a lot of differences, whether it's someone I'm interviewing for a research project or someone in my family, I I try to really just ask questions. And maybe it's because maybe the uncharitable way of describing that would be to say I hide behind my interviewer persona a little bit, and there's maybe some truth to that. But really, I find it's always productive. It always gets me, a few millimeters closer to bridging the gap um, to ask a person questions about their experiences this week, about features of how they grew up. I think we're constantly overestimating how much we really know about one another, even people we've spent most of our lives with, right? I mean, I think especially maybe with close friends and family, you get into a groove and you're just very used to interacting in a certain way, and it is scary to break out of that groove. But maybe just asking that friend or family member a set of questions that you haven't tried before, and often that have nothing to do with maybe whatever the issue is that you disagree about. It can create a new way of maybe gaining a little bit of rapport. So that's
yeah.
that's the very basic conversational tack that I find useful in times like this.
Well, and curiosity, I think, is always an opener for different things. I think it's what makes you a great interviewer is that you're curious about what the other person's thinking, feeling, doing, operating as. So what do you hope that this book is going to do? What's the hope for Spellbound?
Hmm. My hope is that we pay more attention to the broad ways in which humans have remained in many ways the same over the centuries. I think sometimes as modern 21st century people, we adopt a rather condescending attitude toward the past. I mean, human IQ has really not changed very much over thousands of years. And I think, we don't maybe consciously have the thought, oh, those people who lived before the age of, anesthesia and modern plumbing were stupid. But there's a way in which we do condescend to them. And I think a book that focuses on the way in which the abiding questions and hunger that humans feel has really remained rather consistent over the past 400 years can erase some of that condescension. I think too, I mean, I went into my research, I suppose, assuming that the rise of the internet and social media would be this cataclysmic break in my narrative. You know, there'd be before Twitter and after Twitter, essentially. And of course, social media and the way we're all kind of enslaved to the glowing rectangles we carry around in our pockets. This has had enormous effect on how we interact and construct our identities and think of ourselves. But I think there's a tendency in our modern moment to blame everything on technology and use it as an excuse to stop to pull away from maybe deeper, more complicated introspection. And in my research, I found that so many of the trends that people comment on about our current political landscape, it's polarization, it's vitriol, that these are trends that predate the major technological changes. I mean, you have to go back most immediately to the 1990s and the rise of shock jocks like Rush Limbaugh and the kind of polarization that starts to happen in the media. And really the trends are quite continuous from that point to our own time. So there's a way in which I suppose that urges us toward a longer view. And it's both, I mean, I often find being a historian, it's both encouraging and depressing because on the one hand, I feel less alone. I study people in past eras who also felt like their world was falling apart, right? They also were questing for the meaning of life. And it makes me feel as if I have friends, across the eons. But on the other hand, it can be very depressing to think, gosh, we're still wrestling with those same questions. We're not really any better at it. And this is kind of the human condition. And I guess the last thing I'd say is there's a way in which in our current moment where we're very secularized and often the study and engagement of religion is sort of cordoned off as a separate sphere. I'm really trying to make the case in this book that you can't do that and really understand what humans are like, that religion and politics are totally intertwined. And we have to think about them as intertwined to understand American history and understand human nature.
Yeah, well, it's a fascinating topic, and you just articulated that beautifully. How do people find you and get your book?
I am very Googleable, and I do. If you type in mollyworthen.com, you will find my website with all of my stuff that's sort of collated and easy to get and read. And I can also be found pretty easily on the University of North Carolina History Department website. But mollyworthen.com is probably the easiest way.
Beautiful. And anybody who needs to write stuff down, her last name is spelled Worthen, just just in case.
Thank you, Cynthia.
So, I asked the same last question of every guest on this show. The show is called Women Awakening. What do you think is the most important thing about women awakening at this moment on the planet?
Boy, I love how open-ended that is. I I guess I answer this as a historian, as someone who is consistently having my eyes opened to all I can learn from people who lived in periods in the deep past. And I guess the vast differences in the ways women have found meaning and constructed their lives and dealt with constraints, but done so in a way that I don't think we should underestimate, has made me think that there's maybe a hazard, especially for younger women today, in thinking in buying into the message that you should be your own untethered, totally free and unencumbered individual and totally create your own meaning and your own future and be as unburdened as possible by quote unquote old-fashioned ideas of what it is to be a woman. Just think a lot of women have kind of gotten that message from the culture, and then they get to their 30s, their 40s, and beyond, and they realize actually meaning comes out of your place in a community, and there are trade-offs that you make if you buy into the message of relentless professional success at the cost of relationships and family and possibly having children, and that you are forced by our society and our economy to make decisions really early in your life, especially as a woman, that have consequences later on, right? There's a way in which our culture and the messages we get from the culture are sort of out of step with biology, to the great consternation and frustration of women. So you can't have it all. You have to make sacrifices, and I think that we shouldn't be too captive to the dominant message that our free market, get as much money as you can to buy luxuries, get all the fancy credentials that you can get, that culture tells us. We need to have a broader view of what can yield human flourishing, and not be afraid to think beyond the 21st century definition of individual self-actualization, I guess.
Well, that was beautifully said. I think that so many of the people that I've interviewed and so many of the people that are my clients have talked about is like, what is the middle way? What is, can I bring my gifts? Can I be successful? And at the same time, can I create community and experience love and family? So I think it was beautiful what you just said. I'm so grateful that you've been here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this.
Yeah, you're quite brilliant and I love the conversation. All right, ladies, let me say this. First of all, get this book, Spellbound, How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Trump, right? Because I think it's just such an interesting conversation and dialogue for us to enter into. I want you to know that you're here for a reason. I want you to know that your presence on the planet at this time is important, and that you don't have to follow any certain rules. You get to open and say, what works for me? What supports me? What lifts me? What heals me? And how can I be a beneficial presence on the planet? I'm so grateful and honored that I get to be with you. I love you, and I'll see you next time.